It's an odd job, actually, to be in charge of training another country's diplomats, but it's a good end to a career, I think. What I'm going to talk to you about now, I normally talk about over the spread of about 16 weeks, 2 classes a week. So I may overrun by 2 or 3 days, and I hope you all brought sandwiches or something to cope with that. My entire life has been as an academic, and that involves standing up just like this and trying to impart to a new generation a whole body of wisdom, history, experience, critical skills, etc., to equip them to go out and play their part in the world. In the professions, it's kind of worked out that the graduate student makes their biggest impression about 7 years after they graduate. So I've got to be constantly thinking 7 years plus 2. That's 9 years. Well, I was sort of mentally able to do that for most of my career, but now I'm not. And the reason is because the pace of change has accelerated so rapidly that the world of 10 years from now is virtually unimaginable. That's my premise, and that's what I want to talk about. There are 2 aspects to change. What is it? What drives it? Mostly it's technology, and technology is accumulative. That is, as you discover something through science and you apply it through technology, it lays the base for further and further and further inventions. And so you do end up with a cumulative process. Now, there are 2 aspects to change that we need to consider. What is it? What drives it? Mostly technology. And the other most sinister aspect of it, how fast does it go? And how fast can it go? And that's the really threatening aspect of change. I'm not saying that change is bad, but I am saying that you need to understand the process by which change takes place and measure the speed at which it happens. Like all academics, I like to go back to theory. And the interesting thing about change is there are virtually no universities that teach courses on it. They teach courses on managing it, but they don't teach courses on what it is. How you manage something you don't understand is a mystery to me. And I would say that this approach of not really investigating change as a process in itself means that you're going to end up dealing with the consequences of unanticipated change. Now, the way to deal with it is strategically. That is, you take the what-if option, as some businesses do, and you work on trends, projections, and say what happens when. Or you sit down, process change, create change, but never really think about what the consequence is. Imagine, for instance, the car. The car was a toy for 20 to 30 years. It was a rich man's toy. But who suspected that this toy had the capacity to totally de-gut our cities, take all the commerce out to the suburbs, and create a way of life that is now causing serious social problems? So that leaves us with crisis management. And I think if you look around the world today, there's a good argument that that is mostly what we do. Heaven knows we're in the middle of it right now. The euro crisis, the education crisis, the drug crisis, etc. And a good example would be demography. We know that people live longer. If you are an insurance agent, you know pretty well what to expect in terms of longevity. What is very interesting is that politically we never seem to plan for it. So, for instance, an older population is going to have a big effect on the medical service. Well, we can say approximately how much older people are going to live, how much more they're going to require different types of medical treatment, and a lot of that is residential care and nursing care. We could have said this 30 or 40 years ago, but we didn't, partly because politics has a horizon of the next election. So if I talk about what's it going to be like 20 years from now, how do we need to train nurses? This doesn't sell politically. And sad to say, politics responds not to long-term concepts like sustainability or generations yet unborn. It responds to crisis. And so it feeds on its own weakness. That is, it can't think in the long term, therefore it doesn't plan in the long term, therefore everything becomes a crisis. So that's the situation. Now, many, many years ago, a great philosopher, Alfred North Whitehead, said, "The art of civilization is to maintain order during change." You know, if you never remember anything else, that is the best thing you can ever remember, because it is the guideline we need to work with. Alfred died in 1947. He could never have imagined the sort of change we have now. So, let's talk a little bit about theory. Well, first of all, the process of change. Now, the great exponent of the process of change was an Austrian economist who kind of disappeared for a while and now has become popular again. And that's Joseph Schumpeter. And his contribution was to say that change is driven by innovation, technical innovation, the steam age, the information age, and so on. And he plotted it all down as a series of waves, sometimes known as the business cycle. But he said change is cyclical like that. There's a curve of innovation, there's a curve where people get left behind, a dislocation, and a transformation to the new technology. So, left like this, if you don't think like this, then capitalism is brutal, because it's constantly shoving out the old and bringing in the new. Now, if you plot Schumpeter's waves, they get closer and closer and closer. You have less time to adapt to innovation and change. Now that's critical, because when you come to the second philosopher here, that's Alvin Toffler, who wrote a wonderful book in the late 60s called Future Shock. It's still in print. And Future Shock says, change can come at an accelerating pace. Society, its institutions, its instruments and everything try to adapt to that change. It's remember, responsive, not anticipative. But he said, this pace of change will naturally accelerate, and it will reach a point where you cannot adapt, and your institutions and instruments collapse. And let me read you what he said, because he had a wonderful way with words, and still does. He said, "The roaring current of change, a current so powerful today that it overturns institutions, shifts our values, and kills our roots. Change is the process by which the future invades our lives, and it represents the death of permanence." Now that's a pretty terrifying state of affairs. But as you look around, and as I look around, I see more and more evidence of this. We don't work with change. We don't try sufficiently to understand it as a process. We're constantly reacting to the effects of it. And that's bad. So why does this worry me so much? Well, because when I think about this process of change, the accumulation of change, it is on a steeply rising curve. Okay. Now you can try this with anything. Take a technology. Take something familiar. Let's say recorded sound. Recorded sound. Recorded sound. We start 1870. Thomas Edison patents a system for recording sounds kinetically onto wax. It's a cylinder. That's it. That's point one on our graph. The cylinder becomes a disc. The disc becomes both two-sided. The motor becomes electric rather than clockwork. The amplifier becomes electric instead of just kinetic. Where are we now? About 1940. 1870, 1940. But Mr. Edison could walk in the room and recognize his technology right away, because it's exactly what he invented. Then you come up to the post-war period, and we have magnetic tape. So we have reel-to-reel recorders, we have cassettes. We get up to the 1980s, early 1980s, we have the CD. Now we have laser imprinting on a physical image and reading back from it. Andrei Previn said when the CD was produced that this is the end of sound technology. You cannot improve this. Well, of course, that didn't last long. You got the DVD, not the DVD, the MP3. Now we have totally digital, no moving parts. And instead of 3 minutes on Mr. Edison's cylinder, you now have weeks of sound in something the size of a matchbox. And then your MP3 suddenly merges with your phone, along with, YouTube, along with the news, etc. Now, if you plot each of these innovations, the curve will go like this. And it doesn't matter which you take, the curve is going to go like this. So you have less and less time to adapt to anything before the next thing is in the shops and so on. But interestingly here, in this case of recorded sound, Mr. Edison's recordings were sold in stores. You could buy this 78 RPM record in stores. Then they made stereo, which is still Edison. You could buy that in stores. Your cassettes were in the stores. Your CDs were in the stores. Your MP3s, where did the stores go? The stores have gone. Recorded sound is not sold like that anymore. And that's about 3 to 5 million retailers gone. The next thing to go, this. 10 years and it's gone. As a writer, I'm happy about that because it gets rid of all the agents and publishers. And nobody, a writer hates more than agents and publishers. But imagine this, all the bookshops, they're already disappearing. Unfortunately, because we just spent a lot of money on building one. But books, gone. That whole sector of retailing, gone. But that's not what worries me. I'm standing here talking to students and thinking to myself, now, what's happening today? What's happening today is the Large Hadron Collider on the Swiss-French border. Now, this is examining the nature of reality. The physics taught in Harvard School of Physics right now is quantum mechanics, for which, ladies and gentlemen, you have to assume 11-dimensional space. Okay, now we just stepped out of all known reality. 11-dimensional space. What are these? We have 3 plus 1. 3D plus 1 time. Oh, but what happened to time? They just accelerated particles out of CERN to the depths of the Italian Alps, and they arrived sooner than they left. What does that represent? That represents the end of physics. Goodbye, physics. What about this 11-dimensional space? That represents the end of reality. There's no reality. Okay, in the good old days, in the dark ages, when everybody died, before the age of 5, you had no expectation of change. And actually, if you did have an expectation of change, this is not good for your health, because it was either treason or it was heresy. And both cases, you ended up the same way. So, Martin Luther released science on the world. Okay, so now we have to abandon reality, because in 10 years from now, the whole of physics could not be there, and something else is there which requires another 6, 7 dimensions. What are these dimensions? Well, look around this room and tell me what's real. Well, that has to change with science. This is a solid object. Atomic physics says it's a solid object. Subatomic physics tells me that 92% of that is air. Hard to believe, but true. So reality itself will be redefined for this coming generation. What else? Medical science. We used to have curative science, herbs and medicines. Then we had preventive medicine, where people discovered vaccination. Now we have genetic engineering. Where is that taking us? Okay, let me tell you. At Cambridge, there's an Institute of Gerontology, where they look at life and expansion of life. Dr. Aubrey de Grey, who works there, made the following statement. The first person to live to be 1,000 years old is already alive and probably over 60. How are you going to deal with this? Are you ready to meet your great-great-great-great-grandchildren when they come along? Is there enough daytime TV to keep your mind alive? But it's not a joke. This is what the most serious school of gerontology tells us. And you laugh at it and say, no, in nature there's life and death. It's a cycle. Except for the giant sea turtle, which has somewhere along the line lost this aging gene. And it lives more or less until some shark finds it, or it becomes soup, or something of that sort. So it's not a nonsense. And the list goes on and on. Did I miss anything? How on earth are you going to deal with this elimination of death, for instance? It sounds ridiculous until you start looking at what the scientists are saying. Now, how do we prepare for that? Well, when you add in all these things about reality, about quantum physics, when you add in all this stuff about aging, etc., then that is a world that I can't easily envisage. And how do I train somebody to go out and be there? Well, the only thing you can do is for them to be aware of the process of change and realize that there's a responsibility to manage this change, anticipate it, but you're going to have less and less and less time. So you could say that each generation has been a modification of the generation before. I'm just wondering whether the next generation has got anything whatsoever to do with the past. It's the most radical point of transformation, I think, in human knowledge and science since maybe the Neolithic, when we invented agriculture. Are we preparing for it? Not at all, no. Science is interested in finding out. And if they do find out, where do we carry that knowledge forward to the future of what we do? So my plea here is that change becomes a study in itself. Because if you don't examine change, then I don't think you're ever going to be prepared for the future.